Welcome.
The President Zelensky undertake these investigations?
No, sir.
To both of you. Ukraine is an aspirant to the EU. Ambassador Sondland is the ambassador to the EU. Is the Ukraine in the ambassador's portfolio? Ambassador Volker?
Yes, also because the EU sanctions on Ukraine are incredibly important.
Mr. Morrison?
I agree, sir.
I yield back.
Mr. Himes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony today. President Trump has described his July 25th phone call with President Zelensky as quote, perfect. And I think he's done that on Twitter, not once, not twice, but by my count, 11 times. It feels to me like this characterization of perfect is of a piece with the idea that we hear in defense of the president's request to the Ukrainians. That's just normal course of business pursuing anti-corruption. And I've been concerned from the start that this is actually not about going after corruption. It is, in fact, about aiming corruption at the vice president. Mr. Morrison, you listened in on the call in the White House Situation Room. Did you hear the president mention the company CrowdStrike and the server?
I believe so, yes, sir.
Did you hear President Trump mention the Bidens?
Yes, sir.
Did you hear President Trump in the length of that phone call use the word corruption?
No, sir. Sir, I don't believe he did.
Was the request that Ukraine investigate CrowdStrike and the Bidens consistent with what you understood to be official U.S. policy towards combating corruption in Ukraine?
Sir, it was the first I heard of much of this.
In fact, in your deposition, you testified that you wanted to stay away from what you described as this, quote, bucket of investigations. Why did you want to stay away from those issues?
That was what I was advised by Dr. Hill.
You also testified that the president's call was not, and I'm quoting you here, the full-throated endorsement of the Ukraine reform agenda that I was hoping to hear. What did you mean by that?
Sir, what we, myself, Colonel Vindman, others, what we prepared in the package we provided the president was background on President Zelensky, background on his positions about reforming Ukraine, reforming its institutions, rooting out corruption. We were hoping, we recommended the president very clearly support what President Zelensky had run on in his own election and what his Servant of the People Party had run on in its election where it received a majority mandate.
But that didn't come up in the call, did it?
No, sir.
Are you aware of any other discussion in which the president actually raised those things with the new Ukrainian president?
Corruption reform?
Yes.
Sir, it's been some time since I refreshed myself on the discussion that took place at the UN General Assembly, so I hesitate to say did he ever raise it, but he did not raise it at the time of the 25 July phone call.
Okay, switching gears a little bit. You strike me as a process guy, and it's nagging at me because you characterized the Ambassador Sondland's linking in whatever way it happened of Aide to an investigation as the Gordon problem. You said it caused you to roll your eyes. Ambassador Volker said it was everybody in the July 10th meeting thought it was inappropriate. John Bolton characterizes this as the drug deal. So it seems like everybody in the room understands that there's a huge problem here. My understanding is that it would be normal course of business when you have an ambassador out there going rogue, as apparently there was consensus Ambassador Sondland was doing, that either the National Security Advisor, John Bolton, or the Secretary of State might rein them in. Why didn't that happen?
Sir, I can't speak to that, but I would generally agree that ambassadors work for the Secretary of State and the President.
Do you have, you don't have any idea, you worked for him, you don't have any idea why John Bolton would characterize what the ambassador was doing as a drug deal, but not rein him in?
Ambassadors don't work for the National Security Advisor, sir.
No, but John Bolton's national security advisor, he presumably spends time with the Secretary of State. I'm just puzzled that everybody in the room is, characterizing this as the Gordon problem or inappropriate or a drug deal, and the Secretary of State does nothing.
Sir, I'm sorry, was there a question?
Well, yeah, you don't have any insight into that?
No, sir.
Ambassador Volker, you testified that you were troubled once you read the record of the president's July 25th call. You testified, quote, that asking the president of Ukraine to work together with the attorney general to look into this, you can see as it has happened, this becomes explosive in our domestic politics. And in your new testimony, you call this unacceptable. What specifically in that call to the Ukraine president do you find unacceptable or troubling?
It is the reference to Vice President Biden.
Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Conaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This morning we heard much about July 25th call in which the president asked for a favor. At least in Lieutenant Colonel Vindman's mind, that was equivalent to a demand, an order, or a requirement. And yet, in the last part of the conversation between the two heads of state, President Trump talks about a prosecutor that he's particularly in favor of and would like to see stay there. And Zelensky, though, says, Mr. President, no, since we've won the absolute majority in our parliament, the next prosecutor general will be 100% my person, my candidate. Does that, to either one of you, does that sound like a head of state who's been cowed or bullied and is under the thumb of the President of the United States?
Not at all.
No, sir.
All right. The impact of the pause that occurred, the 55-day pause in the lethal assistance or the security assistance, none of us have really understood exactly what happened during that time frame. No one knew about it other than the internal U.S. folks until late August. And so the Russians would not necessarily have known about it. The potential impact that I agree with on Russia's interpretation of our support for Ukraine wasn't known until those last 14 days. But the impact on the lethal aid that they already had, should Russia had tried to move the line of contact further west with their tanks, would the lethal assistance that we had already given been available to them to push back on that?
Yes, it would.
Mr. Morrison, comments?
Sir, I agree with that, but I would also add the hold, as I understood it, applied to Ukraine security assistance, UASI, UASI, and FMF. It did not apply to FMS, and the javelins were provided under FMS.
Okay, so the most lethal weapon that President Trump provided to the Ukrainians, that President Obama in his his national policy, which he set, was available to them should the Russians have pushed their tanks west. The javelins.
Yes, sir.
Throughout that process, even with the pause, even with all the stuff that was going on.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Associated Press is reporting that, Ambassador Volker, you mentioned it earlier, that the Russians in an act of war took 2 gunships and a tug and 24 sailors last November. And yet the Russians have now given the 24 sailors back in September, and the Associated Press is reporting today that they're giving the gunboats and the tug back. Does that sound like a Ukraine is inept at being able to negotiate with the Russians because they're wounded in some way by our actions?
No, I would not say that the Ukrainians are inept.
All right, thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, I would like, as a personal request that you and or one of your members of the committee that are lawyers to put into the record the federal statute that provides for the absolute immunity or right to immunity that you've exerted over and over and over. I don't think it's there, but if it is in fact a federal statute and or a brief that you can cite, put that into the record so that we'll know that. And before you get mad and accuse me of wanting to out the whistleblower, you get upset every time somebody accuses you personally of knowing who the whistleblower is. I get upset every time you, anonymity, every time you accuse me of simply because I want to know the whistleblower, we want to know what's going on, then we want to out that interviewer. That's unfair for you to make that accusation. And I get just as mad. This is about leveling the playing field between our two teams. Your team knows a whistleblower. They have intimate knowledge of who he or she is. The IGIC, as ICIG, even mentioned indicia biases. Your team fully understands that. Our team should fully understand that. It's simply leveling the playing field. And I know that you've overrun my request for a closed door subpoena. I understand that. But I do think that it's important that you put into the record the basis on which you continue to assert this absolute right to anonymity. Excuse me, I misspoke earlier. Anonymity by the whistleblower. Also, the speaker on September the 23rd issued a, dear colleague, that's a document that we all use to talk to each other. It's with the 434 other members of Congress. It was intended to be the truth. It was intended to be straightforward. She says in that, dear colleague, that the whistleblower has, by law, is required to testify to the House and the Senate Intelligence Committees. Now, you're defying the speaker in this regard. I understand that's between you and her, but if she's correct, then you're defying the speaker, they're defying the law. If on the other hand, she misled us into thinking something that was not true, then I think you need to tell the speaker that she needs to retract that dear colleague letter, at least set the record straight. Is the whistleblower required by law, as the speaker said, to testify to us or not? And what is his absolute right to anonymity that you question? For that, I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. I'm happy to enter into the record the whistleblower statute that allows whistleblower to remain anonymous, as well as Ranking Member Nunes' prior comments talking about the
Of course they not gonna tell you
anonymity
who
of
the
whistleblowers.
whistleblower is.
With that, I recognize Ms. Sewell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Volker, it seems by early July, it's become pretty clear that Mr. Giuliani has become a major problem for the U.S.-Ukraine relations. You previously testified that on July 2nd, you met with the Ukrainian president and his aide in Toronto, is that right?
I had a bilateral meeting between the U.S. and Ukrainian delegations, and then a poolside meeting with the president and his chief of staff.
There you discuss Mr. Giuliani's, quote, negative view, quote, of Ukraine based on a conspiracy theory about the 2016 election, right?
I conveyed that he was repeating a negative narrative about Ukraine based on accusations of the then Prosecutor General Lutsenko.
Are you saying that you didn't think that they were negative views?
No, that they were negative views.
Okay, but that wasn't your description.
I'm sorry, I lost the question. If you could repeat.
Well, I was trying to get at who said the negative views that you discussed negative
So
views.
the Prosecutor General of Ukraine
Mhm.
was putting out this series of conspiracy theories that I believe were self-serving and inaccurate. Mr. Giuliani had repeated these to me, so I believe that he was at least affected by those and believed those and was concerned about.
I believe that they were negative.
Believed that they were negative
problematic.
and was conveying them to the president.
So was it problematic that he believed that they were negative views?
Yes, the whole thing was problematic.
Ambassador Taylor testified that on July 2nd, you told Ukrainians that they needed to, quote, cooperate on investigations, end quote. You're now saying that you don't recall that saying those words. Is that correct?
I don't believe I said the words cooperate on investigations.
Did you say investigations?
I believe I did, yes.
And what did you mean by investigations?
I meant Burisma in 2016 was in my mind, but I wanted to keep it general, and that Ukraine, in being convincing to Giuliani and hopefully also to the president that they are serious about fighting corruption, would engage in whatever investigations necessary to clean up the country.
Now, moving to July 10th, Ambassador Volker sent you a text message. You sent a text message to Giuliani, and I think it's
Yes.
on the screen now. And you said, Mr. Mayor, could we meet for coffee or lunch in the next week or so? I'd like to update you on my conversations about Ukraine. I think we have an opportunity to get what you need. Did you say that? Is that an accurate?
That is an accurate text message.
And what
Don't
did you
forget
mean by
to
what
subscribe
you
and
need?
hit that
Contact
notification
with
button,
the actual
people,
government of Ukraine.
as you're learning about what's happening in your country today.
Later that day, you and Ambassador Sondland met with Ukraine officials at the White House. We heard from several
This
witnesses
is
that
live.
Ambassador Sondland told the
Live,
Ukrainians
baby,
that they needed to
live.
cooperate with the quote unquote investigations in order to get the Oval Office meeting that scheduled on the books. Were these investigations a part of the official U.S. policy towards Ukraine?
U.S. policy toward Ukraine was about fighting corruption in Ukraine.
But
going
was
after
it
that.
specifically about these kinds of investigation? You said the investigation was Burisma?
Right.
Okay.
In order to fight corruption, you need to conduct investigations. You need to see what Ukrainian citizens have been up to and doing.
But
So
was that
these
the purpose of that? Or was it because the president, you knew that, that the president wanted those investigations to be done as a condition for them to actually have a meeting in the White House?
Well, first off, we have to be clear what we're talking about in terms of investigations. We're not talking about Vice President Biden. We're not talking about some of the.
Well, Burisma has nothing to do with, you're saying that.
I'm saying that whether Ukrainians within the company of Burisma had acted in a corrupt way or sought to buy influence, that's a legitimate thing for Ukraine to investigate. And if Ukraine can make a statement about their intentions on fighting corruption domestically, that is helpful in order to convince President Trump ultimately that this is.
With all due respect, Ambassador Volker, we heard from 2 witnesses this morning that those investigations were not official U.S. policy. Ambassador Volker, I don't know if you understand what you were getting yourself into, but sitting here today, I trust you understand that pressuring Ukraine to involve itself in U.S. domestic policy is just simply wrong. I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Turner.
I yield my time to Jim Jordan.
I thank the gentleman. Ambassador Volker, you were the special representative to Ukraine, is that right?
That is correct.
And prior to that, in your diplomatic service, you worked at the NSC, you were Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, you were Ambassador to NATO, Senate confirmed Ambassador to NATO in your distinguished diplomatic career. So it may not bother you when you're referred to as the irregular channel, but it bothers Representative Turner, it bothers me. You were the special envoy to Ukraine. And in that role, you said in your opening statement, you were the administration's most outspoken public figure highlighting Russia's invasion and occupation of Ukraine and calling out Russia's responsibility in the war. Is that right?
That is correct.
And in that capacity, you strongly advocated for lifting the ban on sale of lethal defensive arms to Ukraine. Is that right?
That is correct.
And President Trump did it, didn't he?
That is correct.
But in spite of that, President Trump was still skeptical of giving hard-earned tax dollars to Ukraine, right?
Yes.
You said that in your testimony as well. And the reason he's skeptical is, let's be honest, the guy doesn't like foreign aid, right?
That's one reason, and then Ukraine's history of corruption is another.
One of the 3rd most corrupt countries on the planet. And Europe isn't doing enough. And oh, by the way, in the president's mind, he did think Ukraine was trying to influence the 2016 election. Because things happened. The Democrats want to deny it, but when the ambassador from Ukraine here to the United States writes an op-ed on August 4th, 2016, criticizing then candidate Trump, that's certainly trying to influence the election. When Mr. Avakov, a key minister in their government, says all kinds of negative things about candidate Trump, that certainly looks like it's trying to influence the election. And when Mr. Lyshenko states in the Financial Times during the campaign, the majority of Ukrainian political figures want Hillary Clinton to win, that probably sticks in a candidate's mind. I know we all run campaigns. When people say bad things about us in the course of the campaign, we don't necessarily think great things about them. But you were convinced Zelensky was the real deal, right?
That is correct.
Because you spent a lot of time with the guy. And guess what? When Aide was frozen, you knew if you could get these 2 guys together, it'd work out. When Aide was frozen, what did you say? You told the Ukrainians, don't worry about it. Well, you didn't say it. You said, don't be alarmed, right?
That is correct.
And guess what happened? By the time when Aide's frozen and when it's released, all kinds of interactions between President Zelensky and senior U.S. officials, right? Starts with the call with President Trump and President Zelensky. Next day, you meet with President Zelensky in Ukraine. Then we have Ambassador Bolton meeting with him. Then we have Vice President Pence meeting with him. Then we have U.S. Senators Johnson and Murphy meeting with him. And guess what? In none of those meetings, not a single one, did security assistance dollars in exchange for an investigation, not once did they come up. Did that conversation come up? Is that right?
That is correct.
Not once. No discussion of aid for investigations. And as you testified, you never believed aid for investigations was ever being talked about either in any of these conversations.
That is correct.
But what happened in those meetings? They all became convinced of the same thing you knew. They all saw the same darn thing. This guy was the real deal. He is a legitimate reformer. And they all came back They all came back and told the president, hey, Mr. President, this guy's real. Go ahead and release the dollars. Oh, by the way, in that same time frame, you know what else happened? Their parliament, their newly elected parliament, as Mr. Morrison testified to, stayed up all night to pass the reform measures, to get rid of the prosecutor, to put in the Supreme High Anti-Corruption Court, to get rid of this ability, that no one in their Congress and their parliament can ever be hit with a crime. I mean, that's unbelievable. All that happens, and they come back and tell President Trump, hey, guess what? Time to release the dollars.
Time to release the dollars.
Dollars were released.
Yeah, you did your job. You did your job. You got to put up with all this because the Democrats are out to get this president. You did your job just the way Mr. Turner described. You did your job over all these years. All these years, and the Democrats put you through this. You have served our country well. The kind of diplomat we want serving. And here's the saddest, one of the saddest things about all this, what the Democrats are putting us through. You two guys who are here telling it straight, you've both decided you're going to step out of government because of what these guys are doing. And that's the sad thing. People like Ambassador Volker and Tim Morrison, who have served our country so well, are now stepping out of our government because of what these guys are doing. And that's why Mr. Turner got so fired up a few minutes ago. Well, I'm so fired up too, because we appreciate what you guys did. I yield back.
Mr. Carson.
Thank you, Chairman Schiff. Ambassador Volker, I want to focus on the press statement that President Trump and Rudy Giuliani wanted Ukraine to make announcing investigations to benefit President Trump. On August 9th, sir, Ambassador Sondland and you had this exchange. Ambassador Sondland says, Morrison, ready to get dates as soon as Yermak confirms. You reply, excellent. How did you sway him? And Ambassador Sondland says, not sure I did. I think POTUS really wants deliverable. Deliverable here was a public announcement that Ukraine was going to conduct investigations into Burisma and alleged 2016 election interference by Ukraine. Is that correct, sir?
Thank you. I understood the deliverable to be the statement that we had been talking about.
On August 13th, you and Ambassador Sondland discussed a draft statement from Ukraine with Mr. Giuliani. Sir, why did you discuss the draft statement with Mr. Giuliani?
Because
Why you do
the
that?
idea of the statement had come up from Mr. Yermak's meeting with Mr. Giuliani. Remember that Mr. Yermak asked me to connect him with Mr. Giuliani. I did. They had a meeting, and then they both called me afterwards. Mr. Giuliani said that he thought Ukraine should make a statement about fighting corruption. Mr. Yermak said, and we will say also specifically Burisma in 2016. Mr. Yermak provided me a draft statement, and I wanted to be assured that this statement would actually correct the perception that Mr. Giuliani had of Ukraine and what they stand for now, so that that would also be conveyed to President Trump and solve this problem that I had observed with our May 23rd meeting with the president. The problem being that he's getting a bad set of information. A statement like this could potentially correct that.
So was Mr. Giuliani satisfied with this statement?
No, he was not.
Why not?
He believed that it needed to say Burisma and 2016 specifically, or else it would not be credible, would not mean anything new.
So in fact, Mr. Giuliani wanted a statement that referenced Burisma and the 2016 elections explicitly, one that would benefit essentially President Trump. Mr. Ambassador, here's the text you sent to the Ukrainian official on August 13th. Let's put that up on the screen. You said, "Hi, Andre, good talking." Following is the text with an insert at the end for the two key items. Mr. Ambassador, those two key items were specific references to investigations of Burisma and the 2016 elections. Isn't that right, sir?
That is correct.
Did Mr. Giuliani, sir, dictate those two key items to you, sir?
Well, as you see, I just had a conversation with Mr. Yermak to describe to him the conversation that we had just had with Mr. Giuliani. Mr. Giuliani said that it would need to include these things for it to be convincing to him. I put them in so we understood what he was talking about, and I shared it with Andre to say, this is what he is talking about.
And you included them in the proposal to the Ukrainians?
I put it back in to be clear to the Ukrainians, this is what the conversation was.
Mr. Ambassador, if you believe the statement that Mr. Giuliani dictated in August was not a good idea, sir, why were the Ukrainians still considering giving an interview with the same themes in September?
If I may, Congressman, I conveyed this to the Ukrainians in order to be clear, so we knew what the conversation was about, so this was following up on this prior conversation. The Ukrainians then said they had reasons not to do that, and they described those reasons, and I agreed with them, and we agreed to just scrap the statement. From that point on, I didn't have any further conversations about this statement. So I don't know how it came up or why it came up that there would be a possibility of President Zelensky doing an interview with US media later saying something like this, and in the end, he didn't do that either.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Morrison, you said that the president's requests during the July 25th call were not consistent with U.S. policy. I emphatically agree with you, sir. Yet these text messages show that Ambassador Volker spent much of August pressing Ukraine to meet those requests. We can only be grateful. I guess that the president essentially got caught, and Congress passed a law to ensure the funding was released to Ukraine before it was too late. I thank you both for your service. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Dr. Wenstrup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Both you gentlemen, thank you very much for being here. I want to start, if I can, with you, Mr. Morrison, discussing the 725 phone call and the concerns that Lieutenant Colonel Vindman had. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman came to you with edits for the transcript, and you stated
What's
that you
my
accepted
thoughts
all
on
of
what?
those edits. Is that correct?
I
On the
accepted-
whole
accepted all the edits
situation?
that I believed were faithful to what was actually discussed.
Did he come to you with an edit that said that the word demand should be in there?
I don't recall that specifically, sir. No.
He didn't either. How soon after the phone call did he meet with you on that particular issue?
We got the draft as was normal fairly quickly after the call, that same day.
That same day. So today he said, I reported my concerns to Mr. Eisenberg. It is improper for the President of the United States to demand a foreign government investigate a U.S. citizen and political opponent. Now, he was going to Mr. Eisenberg with his concerns about the conversation, yet he did not at any point on the edits say that there should be a demand. And, you know, he didn't do that, but he did say that he didn't come to you with his concerns because you weren't available. But that same day, he came to you with edits. Was that correct?
I believe that's generally correct, yes, sir.
Okay, and well, he said you weren't available, and you didn't hear the president make a demand, did you?
No, sir.
So sometime between the call and today, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman must have been hearing some voices, and he heard demand at the time, but he didn't hear it that day, and he didn't make it an issue that day, but today he does. I think that's pretty bizarre. When Lieutenant Colonel Vindman went to legal, Mr. Eisenberg, do you know if he was advised not to speak to you?
I don't have any firsthand knowledge of that, no, sir.
Do you know if he was advised to contact the IGIC?
No, sir, I have no firsthand knowledge of that.
So you don't know what he was advised when he went to legal?
No, sir, I do not.
That. Mr. Volker, I want to tell you, I really enjoyed your opening testimony today, taking us through that. I know it's kind of long, but I thought it was extremely well done, and I appreciate it. You talk about letters signed and sharing concerns about leadership in your assigned country, about agreeing with and sometimes disagreeing with the leadership of your own country when you felt it was appropriate. And you're the boots on the ground for the administration. Let's face it, you're part of that team that is there to serve the country in that way. And that all to me sounded like the works of a very good diplomat. And I want to thank you for that.
Thank you, sir.
It's truly appreciated. And, you know, corruption was a concern, legitimately, in Ukraine. And in many ways. And Mr. Jordan pointed out some of the things that were done by Ukrainians in plain sight. I might use that term, in plain sight, by putting op-eds in our newspapers. And it's certainly more than one country can be trying to influence our elections. Would you agree with that?
I agree with that.
And, we keep hearing that whole thing about Ukrainians, that's all been debunked. It was just the Russians. Well, that comes from an IC community that some of the people that have come up with those conclusions are some of the very same people that we're going to find out, if we haven't already, were deeply involved with this whole Russian collusion hoax. But I want to say you did a great job. You vetted Zelensky's intentions, what he intended to be as a president. Would you say that's accurate?
Yes, that was in fact one of the key objectives of the presidential delegation at the inauguration, to take our own judgment and report back to the president.
And that's what your job should be. And you became comfortable with this president, correct?
Yes, I did.
And you worked to assure our president that you were comfortable with this
Yes, I did.
president. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And in some ways, you have to work sometimes through any means available. And that might include working with Rudy Giuliani if it could be helpful to you to get that message and advice to the president. Would that be correct?
I believe that the messages being conveyed by Mr. Giuliani were a problem because they were at variance with what our official message to the president was, and not conveying that positive assessment that we all had. And so I thought it was important to try to step in and fix the problem.
And in that, I think you termed that a useful barometer of where things were.
Yes.
So those useful barometers, I think, can come in a lot of different fashions, like Dennis Rodman in North Korea or James Taylor in France singing "You Got a Friend," if they can help the cause. And in that situation, it's not illegal. Good job, Ambassador. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Ms. Spear.
Chairman, thank you. And thank you both for your participation here today and for your service. I'm going to take us out some 30,000 feet for a minute and talk about cover-ups. But for the fact that the whistleblower came forward, we wouldn't know anything about this. But for the fact that the Inspector General of the CIA found it to be both urgent and credible, we wouldn't know anything about it. Mr. Morrison, you said that after you heard the call, you went directly to the attorneys in the National Security Council and recommended that they be limited access, and they were subsequently put into a special server. The White House has not released any documents whatsoever to this committee. So to you, Mr. Volker, thank you. But for the fact that you, as a private citizen with your own personal phone and your text messages with Mr. Giuliani and Mr. Sondland and Mr. Mayak and whomever else, but for those text messages that we've been putting up on the screen all day, we would have nothing. Nothing. And this cover-up would be complete. That's something we should think about. Now, on